What if the reason love felt distant was never the other person, but the silent conversation I was having with myself every day? I remember lying awake, replaying messages, rereading silences, wondering how something that once felt so alive could feel so unreachable. I felt chosen one day and invisible the next, craving reassurance while pretending I didn't need it. I blamed timing, personality differences, emotional wounds, even fate, because it hurt less than questioning my own inner state. There was longing in my chest, but also fear. Fear of not being enough, of being replaced, of being loved conditionally. What confused me most was that no matter who I loved, the emotional pattern felt the same, as if the relationship was echoing something deeper. Only later did I realize the distance I felt outside was mirroring a distance I had accepted within. For a long time, I believed love was unpredictable. I told myself that people change, feelings fade, and closeness is fragile. I never said these things out loud, but they lived quietly in me. They shaped how I waited for messages, how I interpreted tone, how quickly I braced myself for disappointment. What I did not understand then was that love was not responding to my words or my hopes. It was responding to my assumptions. I began to notice a pattern that felt uncomfortable to admit. Whenever I assumed I would be left, I behaved as someone preparing for loss. I became overly alert, emotionally guarded, or silently needy. I didn't demand reassurance directly, but I carried an inner posture of uncertainty, and somehow, that uncertainty always seemed to find confirmation. Responses slowed. Affection softened. Distance appeared. At the time, I thought this proved my fears were correct. Later, I realized it proved something else entirely. I discovered that assumptions are not conscious wishes. They are emotional expectations I accept as normal. In relationships, I wasn't imagining happy endings. I was imagining how things usually go for me. My inner dialogue sounded like realism, but it was actually rehearsal. I was rehearsing being overlooked, misunderstood, or eventually replaced. Love did exactly what I expected it to do, not because the other person was unkind, but because I was living from a state that anticipated loss. The most difficult realization was that no one was doing this to me. I was not being punished or tested. I was simply seeing my inner story, reflected back through another human being. When I assumed love required effort to maintain interest, I attracted situations where I felt I had to perform emotionally. When I assumed affection fades, I noticed every sign of fading and ignored every sign of presence. Love followed the blueprint I carried inside. What changed everything was not trying to control another person, but questioning what I had accepted as true about love itself. I asked myself why I expected inconsistency, why closeness felt temporary, why being chosen felt fragile. These assumptions did not come from the relationship I was in. They existed long before it. I had been loyal to them without realizing it. I began experimenting internally, not by forcing positive thoughts, but by allowing a new assumption to feel natural. I explored what it would feel like to expect emotional continuity instead of emotional volatility. I imagined being someone whose presence was valued without effort, whose affection was returned without strategy. At first, this felt unfamiliar, almost dishonest, because my identity was attached to waiting and wondering. But unfamiliar did not mean untrue. It only meant unpracticed. As I persisted in this new inner stance, my reactions changed. I no longer read silence as rejection. I no longer searched for hidden meanings. I showed up calmer, more grounded, less emotionally reactive. The most surprising part was that I wasn't doing this for the other person. I was doing it because my inner experience had shifted. I felt secure before anything external confirmed it. That was when I saw how love truly operates. It does not respond to desire alone. It responds to assumption. When I assumed I was emotionally safe, interaction softened. When I assumed I was wanted, communication flowed. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There was no sudden confession or cinematic return. Instead, there was a steady alignment between how I felt inside and how love showed up outside. I stopped asking why someone wasn't choosing me and started living as someone who expected to be chosen. Not arrogantly, not defensively, but quietly. This expectation changed my tone, my patience, my presence. Love met me at that level, because that was the level I consistently occupied. What I learned is that love is not something I chase or fix. It is something that organizes itself around the assumptions I hold as normal. If I live as though love is uncertain, it behaves uncertainly. If I live as though connection is stable, it finds stability. This is not magic. It is emotional cause and effect. Once I understood this, relationships stopped feeling like emotional negotiations. They became reflections. And every reflection gave me feedback. Not about the other person, but about what I was assuming to be true about myself and about love. That awareness alone changed how I experienced intimacy, because I was no longer at war with uncertainty. I had changed the quiet rules love was following all along. I used to believe imagination was fantasy, something disconnected from real love. I thought imagination was for daydreams, for escape, for wishful thinking when reality felt disappointing. In relationships, I relied on evidence. Text sent, calls missed, tone of voice, past behavior. I told myself I was being rational. But what I did not see was that my imagination was already active, shaping the emotional atmosphere long before any evidence appeared. Every relationship I experienced had an emotional tone. Sometimes it felt warm and safe, sometimes tense and uncertain. I assumed that tone was created by two people interacting. Later, I realized it was largely created by me, internally, through what I repeatedly imagined to be true. Not visual scenes, not dramatic fantasies, but quiet expectations and inner conversations. I was imagining outcomes constantly, and those imaginings were not neutral. When I cared about someone, my imagination often drifted toward loss. I imagined conversations where I wasn't understood. I imagined distance forming. I imagined myself having to explain my worth. None of this was intentional. It felt like preparation, like emotional intelligence. In reality, it was rehearsal. I was rehearsing a tone of insecurity, and that tone followed me into every interaction. I noticed how imagination worked most clearly during moments of waiting. Waiting for a reply, waiting for reassurance, waiting for clarity. In those moments, nothing external was happening, yet my emotional state shifted dramatically. That shift did not come from facts. It came from what I was imagining the silence meant. My body responded to imagined meaning as if it were already real. Tightness, anxiety, sadness, all before anything actually occurred. This was the moment I understood that imagination is not passive. It is creative. It generates feeling first, and feeling determines how I show up. When I imagined being unwanted, I felt small. When I felt small, I communicated differently. My voice softened. My words became cautious, my presence less grounded. The relationship responded to that tone. Not because anyone intended harm, but because emotional environments are contagious. I began experimenting with imagination in a different way. Instead of imagining outcomes, I imagined states. I asked myself what it would feel like to be emotionally secure in love. Not temporarily reassured, but fundamentally safe. I imagined myself reading a message calmly, speaking openly, existing without tension. I did not attach this to a specific person's behavior. I attached it to my own inner experience. At first, this felt unnatural. My imagination was trained to scan for danger, not stability. But I persisted, gently. When my mind drifted into anxious scenarios, I redirected it. Not forcefully, but deliberately, toward a sense of emotional steadiness. I imagined conversations where I was heard. I imagined silence that felt neutral instead of threatening. These imaginal acts were subtle, but they changed how my body felt. As my inner tone softened, my reactions softened. I stopped filling gaps with fear. I stopped interpreting ambiguity as rejection. I noticed that people responded differently, not because I demanded change, but because I was no longer broadcasting emotional instability. Imagination had shifted my internal climate, and relationships adjusted to that climate naturally. What surprised me most was that imagination did not need to be dramatic to be effective. It did not require visual detail or constant repetition. It required consistency of feeling. When I consistently imagined myself as emotionally safe, love reflected that safety. Communication became clearer. Affection felt less conditional. Even when challenges arose, they did not destabilize me in the same way. I also realized that imagination works whether I am aware of it or not. Ignoring it does not neutralize it. If left unattended, it defaults to past patterns. That is why relationships often feel repetitive. I was not attracting the same situations by coincidence. I was imagining from the same emotional identity. Once I understood this, I stopped blaming circumstances. I stopped waiting for proof before allowing myself to feel secure. I allowed imagination to lead instead of follow. I felt stability first, and stability appeared more often. This was not about control. It was about coherence between my inner world and my outer experiences. Imagination, I learned, is not pretending something is true. It is selecting the emotional lens through which reality organizes itself. When I changed that lens, the tone of love changed. Not instantly, not magically, but unmistakably. And for the first time, relationships felt less like emotional negotiations and more like shared spaces I could inhabit without fear. For a long time, I believed how others treated me was a reflection of their character, their maturity, or their emotional availability. I thought respect, consistency, and affection were things I had to earn or negotiate. I told myself that if I communicated better, gave more, or asked less, I would finally be treated the way I wanted. What I did not see was that all of this effort was happening on the surface, while the real decision had already been made beneath it. The way I saw myself in relationships was not flattering, even when I appeared confident. Internally, I carried a quiet sense of replaceability. I believed I was lovable, but not essential, appreciated, but not prioritized. This self-image was subtle, but it governed everything. It shaped what I tolerated, what I overlooked, and what I silently justified. I didn't demand clarity because I didn't expect it. I didn't insist on consistency because I wasn't convinced I deserved it. I noticed that my boundaries were unclear, not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I wasn't sure I had the right to expect it. When someone pulled away, I blamed timing instead of questioning my self-concept. When effort became one-sided, I rationalized it instead of recognizing a pattern. My self-image was setting the terms, and others were simply responding to those terms. The realization came slowly, through repetition. Different people, similar dynamics. Different stories, same emotional position. I was always the one adapting, understanding, waiting. That was when I had to confront the uncomfortable truth. I was relating to others from a version of myself that expected less. And love was treating me accordingly. Changing how I saw myself was not about affirming worth intellectually. I already believed I had value in theory. The issue was how I felt about my value emotionally. Did I feel chosen, or did I feel hopeful? Did I feel secure, or did I feel cautious? These distinctions mattered. Hope waits. Security stands, and I was living from hope, not from knowing. I began observing my inner posture during interactions. I noticed how quickly I deferred, how often I minimized my needs, how easily I accepted uncertainty as normal. These were not personality traits. They were expressions of self-concept. I saw myself as someone who had to be flexible to be loved, rather than someone whose presence naturally inspired commitment. Once I saw this clearly, I realized that no conversation could override an identity. I could ask for reassurance, but if I internally believed I was optional, reassurance would never last. I could request effort, but if I expected inconsistency, effort would fluctuate. The treatment I received was aligned with who I believed. I was in the emotional hierarchy of the relationship. I started shifting that identity internally, quietly. I imagined myself as someone whose time mattered, whose emotions were respected, whose absence would be felt. I didn't imagine others changing. I imagined myself occupying a different position. I felt what it would be like to be valued without needing to prove it. This feeling was unfamiliar, but grounding. As this self-image stabilized, my behavior changed without effort. I spoke more directly. I waited less anxiously. I no longer chased clarity. And something subtle but powerful happened. People responded differently. Not dramatically, not universally, but consistently. The dynamic shifted. Respect increased. Communication improved. In some cases, distance dissolved. In others, it became clear who could meet me at this level and who could not. What mattered was not the outcome, but the alignment. I was no longer negotiating my worth through reactions. I was expressing it through presence. Love responded to that presence, because relationships are structured around perceived value, and perceived value begins internally. I learned that self-concept is not ego. It is the emotional role I assign myself. When I see myself as secondary, I am treated as secondary. When I see myself as central, I am treated with centrality. Others do not decide this for me, they reflect it. This realization freed me from resentment. No one was withholding love from me. I was withholding a higher self-concept from myself. Once I changed how I saw myself, love had no choice but to reorganize around that image. Because that was the version of me that showed up consistently. I used to believe that people showed me who they were, and my job was to respond. I thought relationships were about reacting appropriately to behavior, adjusting to moods, and managing expectations. What I did not realize was that, before anyone acted toward me, I had already assigned myself a role in the emotional dynamic. Others were not just showing me who they were reflecting who I believed I was within the relationship. That role was not something I consciously chose. It was something I accepted quietly. Sometimes I saw myself as the one who understands more, gives more, waits more. Sometimes as the one who needs reassurance, patience, or clarity. These roles felt familiar, even comforting, because they aligned with my inner narrative. But familiarity does not mean truth. It only means repetition. I noticed that when I internally positioned myself as the one who might be left, others seemed less anchored. When I felt like the one who needed to earn affection, others appeared less consistent. This was not manipulation or intention. It was resonance. Emotional roles are not enforced, they are mirrored. People instinctively occupy the complementary position to the one I assign myself. When I saw myself as uncertain, someone else became certain for me. When I saw myself as waiting, someone else became the one being waited on. When I saw myself as adaptable, Someone else became the one being accommodated. None of this was discussed. It happened silently, through energy, through tone, through presence. The realization that changed everything was understanding that I could change the role without changing the person. I didn't need to demand new behavior. I needed to occupy a different emotional position internally. I needed to stop relating as someone seeking validation and start relating as someone who expects mutuality. I began noticing my internal dialogue during interactions. Was I bracing? Was I anticipating disappointment? Was I trying to be easy to love? Each of these inner movements placed me in a lower emotional role. And each time, the reflection was immediate. Not obvious, but consistent. I experimented by shifting my inner stance. I imagined myself as emotionally equal, not above or below. I imagined conversations where I was not trying to be chosen, but already chosen. I imagined myself listening without anxiety, speaking without over-explaining. This was not visualization for outcome. It was alignment with a different role. As I persisted, the mirror changed. People leaned in more. Communication became balanced. Effort felt shared rather than negotiated. In some cases, relationships naturally adjusted. In others, they dissolved. Not because something failed, but because the previous roles were no longer compatible. What I learned is that relationships are agreements of identity. When I change who I am being, the agreement must change too. Others cannot continue playing a role I no longer assign myself. This is not control, it is coherence. Emotional systems seek balance. I also learned that blaming others kept me trapped in the same role. If I saw someone as distant, I reinforced myself as the pursuer. If I saw someone as inconsistent, I reinforced myself as the one waiting. The moment I reclaimed my position internally, the labels lost power. This understanding brought relief. I no longer needed to analyze behavior endlessly. I needed to observe reflection. What was this interaction showing me about how I was seeing myself? That question replaced confusion with clarity. Once I changed the role I occupied, love responded differently. Not because people changed personalities, but because the emotional choreography changed. And I realized that I had always been more influential than I thought. Not through force, but through self-definition. For most of my life, I believed intimacy changed because circumstances changed. I thought closeness increased when communication improved, when misunderstandings were resolved, when time aligned, or when effort increased. I waited for something outside of me to soften before allowing myself to feel safe, open, or relaxed. What I did not understand then was that feeling is not the result of intimacy. It is the condition that allows intimacy to exist. I noticed that whenever I felt guarded inside, no amount of words created closeness. Conversations could be frequent, affectionate, even deep, yet something remained slightly distant. On the other hand, there were moments when nothing significant was said, but the connection felt warm and natural. The difference was not what happened between us. It was what I felt within myself. I began observing my emotional state before interactions, not during them. Was I tense? Was I anticipating disappointment? Was I hoping to be reassured? These feelings shaped how I listened, how I responded, and how present I actually was. Even when I smiled or said the right thing, my emotional undercurrent carried uncertainty. Intimacy cannot grow in an environment where the nervous system is braced. What I learned was that intimacy responds to feeling, not intention. I could intend closeness, desire connection, and even act lovingly, but if I felt unsafe, unworthy, or anxious, that feeling set the limit. Love did not deepen because I asked for more. It deepened when I felt more at ease being myself. This realization was confronting, because it meant I could not wait for someone else to make me feel secure. If I did, intimacy would always be conditional. I had to learn how to generate a feeling of emotional safety internally, without external proof. Not by pretending everything was fine, but by choosing how I related to myself. I started with small shifts. Before responding to a message, I paused and softened my body. I allowed myself to feel grounded rather than reactive. When I noticed anxiety, I did not fight it. I changed the meaning I gave it. Instead of interpreting it as a sign of impending loss, I treated it as a habit that no longer defined me. I also noticed how often I withheld emotionally, believing that restraint would protect me. I thought that staying slightly distant would prevent pain. In reality, it prevented intimacy. Feeling is not vulnerability without discernment. It is openness without self-abandonment. When I allowed myself to feel warmth without attachment to outcome, closeness became natural rather than risky. As I practiced this, something subtle shifted. I stopped measuring intimacy by frequency of contact or intensity of expression. I felt connected even in simplicity. I felt secure even without constant reassurance. And that internal stability created space for the other person to relax as well. Intimacy is reciprocal, not because people mirror actions, but because they mirror emotional availability. I realized that when I felt whole, I did not reach for closeness to fill a gap. I shared closeness as an extension of fullness. That difference changed everything. Conversations flowed without pressure. Silence felt comfortable rather than threatening. Touch felt grounding rather than urgent. Feeling, I discovered, is the bridge between imagination and experience. It is what turns an inner assumption into a lived reality. When I felt loved internally, love expressed itself externally. Not always in the same form, not always immediately, but consistently enough to confirm the pattern. This did not mean relationships became perfect. Challenges still arose. Misunderstandings still happened. But they no longer destabilized me. Because intimacy was no longer something I feared losing. It was something I carried within myself. And when intimacy is carried internally, it invites expression rather than demand. I stopped chasing closeness and started embodying it. And love responded, not because I tried harder, but because I felt differently first. For a long time, I believed attachment was about how much I cared. I thought the depth of my feelings justified the intensity of my focus. I told myself that thinking often about someone, analyzing every interaction, and emotionally holding on to outcomes was a sign of love. What I did not see was that attachment was not strengthening connection. It was tightening fear. Internally, I was holding on to how things should go, how someone should feel, how the future should unfold. I called this commitment, but emotionally it felt like tension. I noticed that the more attached I became to a specific outcome, the less present I felt. My attention moved from the moment into imagined futures, where something could go wrong. Attachment pulled me out of now and placed me into anticipation. I began noticing that attachment did not come from love itself. It came from insecurity. When I felt complete within myself, attachment loosened naturally. When I felt uncertain, attachment increased. This was not a moral issue. It was an emotional one. Attachment was my attempt to stabilize something externally because I did not feel stable internally. Letting go did not mean caring less. It meant releasing the internal grip I had on how love needed to appear in order for me to feel okay. I realized I was attaching not to the person, but to the role they played in regulating my emotions. When I needed someone else to confirm my worth, attachment became heavy. When I allowed myself to feel grounded independently, attachment softened. At first, the idea of letting go felt dangerous. I feared that if I relaxed internally, connection would fade. I believed effort and vigilance were necessary to keep love alive. But this belief itself was creating strain. Love does not deepen under pressure. It deepens under ease. I practiced letting go in subtle ways. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped checking emotional temperature constantly. When thoughts drifted toward control or prediction, I gently returned to the present feeling of steadiness. This was not avoidance. It was trust. Trust in my inner state rather than in external guarantees. As I let go internally, my behavior changed naturally. I responded instead of reacted. I allowed space without interpreting it negatively. I showed interest without urgency. And something unexpected happened. Attachment shifted externally. People felt less pulled away, less defensive, less pressured. Connection felt lighter, more mutual. I realized that attachment invites distance because it carries expectation. When I attach to an outcome, I silently demand confirmation. Even if unspoken, that demand is felt. Letting go removes the demand. It creates emotional freedom, which allows others to choose connection rather than feel obligated to maintain it. Letting go also clarified truth. When attachment softened, I could see relationships more clearly. I could sense alignment without distortion. I could recognize when something flowed naturally and when it required effort that did not feel mutual. Letting go did not cost me love. It gave me clarity. I learned that attachment is not proof of love. Presence is. And presence cannot coexist with inner grasping. The more I trusted my inner stability, the less I needed to hold on to external reassurance. Love responded to that trust because trust is spacious. It invites closeness rather than constriction. This shift did not make me passive. It made me centered. I still expressed care. I still valued connection. But I no longer tried to secure it emotionally. I allowed it to meet me where I was. And where I was, internally, was calm. Letting go internally was not an act of loss. It was an act of alignment. It aligned me with a version of myself that did not need to cling in order to be loved. And that version experienced love more freely because it was no longer filtered through fear. For a long time, I thought emotional safety in relationships came from reassurance, from promises, from repeated proof that someone would stay. I believed safety was built through what others did consistently. If they showed up regularly, communicated clearly, and expressed commitment, then I could finally relax. What I did not realize was that no amount of external consistency could stabilize me if my inner state kept changing. Inside, I was inconsistent. Some days I felt confident and grounded. Other days I felt doubtful, anxious, or guarded. My inner world fluctuated based on mood, memory, or minor triggers. I carried these shifts into relationships without noticing. I expected others to feel safe with me while I was emotionally unstable within myself. That contradiction shaped everything. I noticed that when my inner state was calm, interactions felt easy. Even difficult conversations unfolded with respect. When my inner state was tense, the same interactions felt fragile. Words landed differently. Silence felt heavier. Emotional safety was not being lost. It was never fully established because the foundation kept moving. Consistency, I learned, is not repetition of behavior. It is continuity of state. When I was internally steady, others relaxed. When I oscillated between closeness and fear, others became cautious. Not because they intended to withdraw, but because emotional unpredictability does not feel safe to engage with deeply. I began observing how quickly my internal state shifted in response to small events. A delayed reply could change my mood. A brief tone shift could alter my confidence. These reactions were automatic, but they revealed something important. My sense of safety was outsourced. I had placed it in the hands of external behavior rather than in my own emotional regulation. To create emotional safety, I had to become someone whose inner state did not collapse under uncertainty. This did not mean becoming detached or unfeeling. It meant becoming consistent in how I related to myself. When I felt anxious, I did not dramatize it. When I felt unsure, I did not spiral. I allowed feelings to pass without letting them redefine me. As I practiced this, my presence changed. I was no longer emotionally volatile. I did not oscillate between closeness and withdrawal. I did not test affection or seek constant reassurance. I became predictable in the best way, grounded, responsive, emotionally available. Others responded to this shift immediately. Conversations deepened. Trust formed without discussion. Emotional openness increased. Safety was no longer something we tried to build. It emerged naturally because the environment supported it. Emotional safety is not declared. It is felt. I realized that people feel safest with those who are internally consistent. Not perfect. Not always happy, but stable in identity. When I knew who I was regardless of circumstance, others knew how to meet me. They did not have to guess which version of me would show up. That reliability invited closeness. Consistency also reduced conflict. When misunderstandings occurred, they did not escalate. I did not interpret them as threats. I stayed present instead of defensive. Emotional safety does not prevent challenges. It allows challenges to be navigated without rupture. I stopped expecting others to regulate my emotions for me. That expectation had been unfair and unsustainable. When I took responsibility for my inner state, relationships felt lighter. There was less pressure, less emotional labor, less unspoken tension. What surprised me most was how quickly safety dissolved when I abandoned consistency. On days when I reverted to old patterns, overthinking, self-doubt, emotional reactivity, I could feel the shift immediately. Distance crept in. Communication tightened. This feedback was not punishment, it was information. It showed me how powerful inner consistency truly was. Emotional safety, I learned, is not something I demand or request. It is something I offer through presence. When I am safe with myself, others experience me as safe. And when safety is mutual, love has room to deepen without fear. This understanding changed how I approached relationships. I no longer searched for certainty outside. I cultivated steadiness within. And from that steadiness, emotional safety formed naturally, not as a promise, but as a lived experience. For a long time, I believed love was unstable by nature. I thought relationships naturally went through cycles of closeness and distance, clarity and confusion, intensity and withdrawal. I accepted emotional fluctuation as normal and even expected it. What I did not recognize was that the instability I experienced in love was not random. It was tracking the instability of how I saw myself. My self-concept in relationships was fragmented. Some days I felt confident, grounded, and worthy of commitment. Other days I felt uncertain, easily replaced, or emotionally dependent. I did not notice these shifts clearly because they felt like reactions to circumstances. In reality, circumstances were reacting to me. Love did not feel stable because I was not stable in who I believed myself to be. I noticed that whenever I felt secure in myself, relationships felt calm, communication flowed, affection felt natural, even silence felt neutral. But when my self-concept wavered, love mirrored that wavering. I questioned interest. I searched for reassurance. I interpreted neutrality as rejection. The relationship had not changed, my internal identity had. Self-concept is not what I think about myself intellectually. It is what I assume about my position emotionally. Am I someone who is chosen, or someone who hopes to be chosen? Am I someone who expects reciprocity, or someone who waits for it? These assumptions are lived, not spoken, and love responds to them precisely. When my self-concept was unstable, I unconsciously sought validation. I needed evidence to confirm I was valued. That need created pressure. Pressure created distance. Distance reinforced my insecurity. The cycle felt external, but it was internal from beginning to end. Stabilizing myself concept did not mean inflating my ego or denying vulnerability. It meant anchoring my identity in something consistent. I chose to see myself as emotionally sufficient, worthy of presence, and capable of connection without losing myself. I practiced returning to this identity regardless of external fluctuation. This practice was quiet. It did not involve confrontation or control. It involved repetition of inner alignment. When doubts arose, I did not argue with them. I returned to the feeling of being centered. When uncertainty appeared, I did not dramatize it. I grounded myself in the assumption that I was not at risk. As this concept stabilized, love stabilized with it. Relationships no longer felt fragile. They could stretch without snapping. Distance no longer meant danger. Closeness no longer felt overwhelming. Love became less reactive because I became less reactive. I also noticed that people responded to this stability instinctively. They trusted me more. They communicated more openly. They showed up more consistently. Not because I demanded it, but because my presence no longer carried emotional volatility. Stability invites stability. What changed most was my experience of myself within love. I no longer lost my center when I cared deeply. I no longer confused intensity with intimacy. I could enjoy connection without fear of collapse. Love felt grounded, not dramatic. This did not mean every relationship lasted. Some ended naturally. But even endings felt different. They did not dismantle my identity. They did not shake my sense of worth. Because my concept was no longer built on being chosen by a specific person. It was built on knowing who I was regardless. I realized that love does not require constant reassurance when concept is stable. It does not require monitoring or protection. It requires presence. And presence is only possible when identity is secure. Stability in love is not created by promises, labels, or timelines. It is created by the quiet certainty of who I am being while I love. When that certainty remains intact, love reflects it. When it falters, love reflects that too. Once my concept stopped shifting with circumstances, love stopped feeling like a test. It became an experience. And in that experience, stability was no longer something I hoped for. It was something I lived.